God doesn't negotiate his righteousness. God doesn't do away with his justice, but he retains his justice, he retains his righteousness, and he truly punishes sin. Because there really was a cross. And on that cross there was real propitiation, where there was a real satisfaction for the requirements of God's justice. But it was done vicariously. This satisfaction for your sin, if you're a believer, was accomplished by Christ, not by you. Do you know why it wasn't accomplished by you? Because you couldn't. It required a sinless person. And that eliminates most of us, which would be the understatement of the year. It eliminates all of us. Again, if the Lord would mark iniquity, who would stand? Not me. Not you. But the glorious gospel is, now the righteousness of God is revealed through that one whose righteousness is made available to all who believe, who by his blood has been a propitiation for us on the cross. Where's the boasting then? Paul's asking not a why question, a how question, a who question, or a when question. It's a where question. It's a question of location. Looking around now, I said, where's the boasting? If this is true, well, where do I hear the boasting from? Huh? Any boasting in here? People who have earned their way into heaven? Where is it? What's the apostle say? It's excluded. You know, Christianity is an exclusive religion. It excludes things. It excludes people. It excludes unrepentant sinners from the family of God. And it excludes boasting from the family of God. It's also inclusive. It includes everyone, Jew or Greek, black or white, male or female, whatever, who puts their trust in Christ and in Christ alone. Now, Paul, to further examine this and explain this, he goes back to the Old Testament and he brings forth Exhibit A for our consideration. Who is Father Abraham? He said, look at Abraham. What did Abraham do with respect to salvation? And he goes back to Genesis 15 and he quotes it, where God makes a covenant promise to Abraham. And we read in Genesis 15 these words, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. And Paul goes on to labor the point that before Abraham offered Isaac on the altar, before Abraham was circumcised, before Abraham did a single act of obedience, God counted him righteous. You see, that's justification by faith alone with a vengeance. That's justification by the imputation of righteousness. It's justification by the assigning or the transferring legally of one person's righteousness to another. Last week in Washington at our seminar, we had a Q&A session, and somebody asked me this question from the floor. They said, R.C., what do you regard as the greatest threat to the evangelical church today, right now? And I said, for me, it's the whole new perspective on Paul actions going on throughout academic considerations in the so-called evangelical world. Because in the midst of this is a wider and wider and wider rejection of imputation of the righteousness of Christ as the grounds of our salvation. This in circles that call themselves evangelical. And I said, here's why it's so serious. Without imputation, without the imputation of the righteousness of Christ to you by God, by faith, you don't have justification by faith, because imputation is essential to the doctrine of justification by faith alone. And without the doctrine of justification by faith alone, you know what else you don't have? You don't have the gospel. So it's QED. Without imputation, as far as I'm concerned, there is no gospel. And when this concept of imputation gets more and more obscured and eclipsed in our day, look out for another dark ages where the gospel itself is eclipsed and people go back to some kind of works righteousness, because that's the only alternative to justification by the imputation of somebody else's righteousness. So Paul labors that it's through believing that Abraham was justified. The moment he had faith, not the moment after he had inherent righteousness, not after he was sanctified, not after he was made righteous, but before he did anything except believe God, God counted him as righteous. And then he goes on to explain how the just are justified by faith and not works. And then he talks about the consequences of justification. Chapter 5, being justified, therefore we have what? Peace with God and access into his presence. That hostility that previously existed between an angry God against a rebellious creation, where men are by nature enemies of God. I mean, you've been taught all your life that by nature you're a child of God. No, by nature you're a child of wrath. Only by supernature, only by conversion do you become a child of God. The only way you're a child of God is if God adopts you through his grace. But your natural birthright is wrath. And the only merit that you have to bring before God is your demerit. Even as Augustine said, the best works of the greatest saints never go beyond what he called splendid vices. Because even after conversion, the best things that we ever do are always and everywhere tainted to some degree by the flesh, that pound of flesh that we carry with us until the day that we're glorified in heaven. And so then Paul speaks about the marvelous benefits and consequences of being justified, of being welcomed into the family of God, and escape from the consequences of original sin and so on. And then in chapter 6, he asks a question. Well, what should we say then? What should our response be to the gospel? If God accepts us while we were still sinners, if Christ died for us while we were still sinners, and in fact, where our sin abounded, Paul said, grace did that much more abound. The more we sinned, the greater the grace. Now, how does the sinner get a hold of that statement and say, ooh, well, if the more I sin, the more grace I get? That sounds pretty cool. Paul says, what shall we say then? Should we continue in sin that grace may abound?